Wiswell, pronounced locally as Wizzel, as in the unsavoury underparts of a warthog, is the sort of village where, if you drive anything less flashy than an open-top Jaguar, they're likely to beat you up and throw you in Old Molly's Well, which we couldn't find. Unsurprisingly really, because it dried up long ago, but from which the village originally took its name. It's the sort of village where anybody passing through is required to carry a leper's clapper and use it, just in case any residents are watching. It's full of crumbling bits, although not too crumbling, with names such as Chapel Fold and the Old Vicarage and the Abbot's Stables, even though there's no sign of a church anywhere, although, to be fair, John Parslew, the last abbot of Whalley Abbey, did live in Wizzel before he was executed in 1537 for his part in the Pilgrimage of Grace. His ghost is said to walk from the Shade Cross, which is actually a Norse cross base with a 19th century replica shaft stuck in it, a metaphor for the village itself, to Wizzel Hall, which we didn't film because it no longer exists. The previously mentioned Old Vicarage House is said to contain 3 secret rooms, presumably priest holes since the building was constructed in the Elizabethan period. Otherwise, Operation Newtree would have been onto them by now. The opulence / effluence of the village is reflected in the name of Wizzel's solitary tavern, the Freemasons' Arms. The Freemasons don't need to use apostrophes. A gastropub where you'd need to sell a kidney, or get your butler to sell one of his at any rate, in order to afford pie and chips. It'd probably be worth it though. The food does look good. It smells good too. How it actually tastes we'll never be rich enough to find out. The Freemasons' Arms takes its name from the fact that the building originally consisted of 3 cottages, one of which was a Freemasons' lodge, which just about says it all, to be honest. There was a proper pub in Wizzel about a century and a half ago, the Lamb Inn. It stood next to the phone box in the now hyperbolically named Coronation Gardens. These days, the former inn is known as just Clegg House, a private residence with an unusual taste in garden ornaments. At one time, there was a corner shop, a school, and yes, an actual church in Wizzel, but the open-top Jaguars, with their ability to travel to the better-equipped Whalley without wearing their owner's boots out, eventually put paid to them. On the hilltop overlooking the village stands a stone or two known as Jep Nave Grave. There's a barrow nearby. We didn't climb up there because, to be honest, we couldn't be bothered, what with Jeannie McIntosh's knees being creakier than Eric Pickles' toilet seat after a visit to Pizza Hut. However, the grave is said to belong to a robber who was beheaded and buried up there because none of the surrounding villages wanted him. Another version claims that back in the mists of time, a servant girl working at Cold Coats Farm discovered a tramp called Jacko Naps asleep in their dairy. Naturally, she hit him to death. As none of the locals could be arsed forking out for a funeral, they dragged his corpse to the top of the hill and placed several boulders on his head, one of which, an enterprising local by the name of Robert Lowe in 1608, reappropriated for the cover of his kiln. Jep Nave Grave marks part of the boundary between Wizzel and Pendleton, as recorded in 1342. Back in those days, the residents would annually beat the bounds, bumping, bouncing, headbutting small boys into the ground to help them remember the boundaries for future generations. Don't ask me, these rural folk with their open-top Jaguars have some weird ways. Unsurprisingly, we soon got tired of Wizzel, so we whizzled off to Much Hool Church, which sounds like something out of Father Brown. St Michael's at Much Hool is one of those churches that's been growing organically since the 11th century, with Tudor and Jacobean Dutch-patterned brickwork, Georgian balconies, crowbarred into place with scant regard for the windows, and Victorian adornments. The tower was added in 1719. A large pulpit with ornate tester dated 1695 stands to the north side of the chancel. Apparently, I haven't got a clue what ornate testers are either. They sound like something from a male strip show. In 1632, the curate was the interestingly named Reverend Fogg, who was a tyrannical Puritan by all accounts. He was silenced in 1660 during the Reformation for nonconformity, and that's about all we could find out about the place, so we buggered off to Samlesbury instead. Samlesbury Church is dedicated to St Leonard the Less, i.e. St Leonard of Noblack, born of Frankish nobility, the patron saint of women in labour, barrel makers, coopers, blacksmiths, captives, prisoners, childbirth, coal miners, greengrocers, coppersmiths, farmers, ordinary grocers, horses, locksmiths, miners and porters. So quite a busy bloke then. Exactly what was less about him, history, fortunately perhaps, doesn't record. The church was founded in 1096, the graveyard, oddly, consecrated by two travelling bishops. But as usual, it had fallen into disrepair by 1558, and subsequently underwent major renovations by Edward Stanley, the 3rd Earl of Derby. Or rather, it underwent major renovations by workmen paid by Edward Stanley, the 3rd Earl of Derby. At any rate, it seems unlikely he was hands-on. They're not exactly seamless renovations either, the joins still clearly visible. The church contains a Norman tub font, a medieval bell from Whalley Abbey, and the funerary armour of Sir Thomas Southworth from 1546. There's also an invasion beam used to secure the door back in 1322 to protect the villagers from marauding Scots. That's Glaswegian weekend for you. However, as usual nowadays, the door was locked, so that buggered up any chances of us filming inside. There's the grave of a witch near the yew tree, which, according to tradition, had long iron spikes driven into it to stop the old battle axe escaping. The spikes are gone now. The grave was vandalised in 1971, and part of it was stolen. There's also a Grade 2 listed sundial in the churchyard with a plate on it dated to 1742. There's also a Grade 2 listed stone font that was moved from inside the church with the initials TW and the date 1749 carved into it. They must have produced some massive babies back in the 18th century. You could baptise a bloody elephant in that. Presumably the babies were all taught to swim, or crawl at any rate, before being dipped. On which stultifying image it's time to draw this episode to a close. Click like, go on, it won't hurt you. Subscribe if you want, but whatever else you do, don't forget to join us for the next eclectic episode of Lancashire Footnotes.